As a World War II pilot, he crash-landed a B-17 bomber and nearly lost his life. A decade later, while a sergeant in the Los Angeles Police Department, he found his true calling, writing television shows. His name was Gene Roddenberry, a name known around the world as the creator of the Star Trek franchise and a rebel who changed the very nature of television.
Gene was very special. I mean, only Gene could create a show like Star Trek.
One day called me into his office and he said, would you read this? Tell me what you think. I took it home and I read it, and it was called Star Trek. And I really liked it.
Vision was very good. An evolved society, mankind, wise enough to know that war is not the answer.
This is the story of its creator, Gene Roddenberry, and how he turned his vision for a future free of intolerance and inequality into a worldwide phenomena.
Network people and business people was, we can't promote one worldism. This should be a good old American ship with good old American types. And I managed to resist doing that. I refused.
His hope was to inspire a generation to have hope for tomorrow. Gene Roddenberry's own trek began during World War II in the jungles of the Pacific. In November of 1942, the 21-year-old bomber pilot was returning from a mission against Japan. As his B-17 bomber landed, it lost its brakes and crashed into the surrounding jungle. Roddenberry survived, but 2 of his crewmates died. It was an event that shadowed him the rest of his life.
He just refused to die. He told me one day, he said, I came so close to death, I knew I had a choice. I can refuse to die or I can give up and die. And he said, I was going to make this world better.
Roddenberry, like hundreds of thousands of other soldiers, began to plan for their lives off the battlefield. The military, in an effort to help the troops decide what to do after the war, produced a film for the returning troops, highlighting the future job opportunities in the fledgling world of television.
What kind of world are we going to live in when we get our permanent furlough?
Meet Mr. Gilbert Seldes, head of production of the Columbia Broadcasting System.
They tell me that a great many of you may be interested in jobs in television production. But I think you're entitled to the hard, solid facts in the case. As of spring 1945, we are employing 62 people. They work the full week, put on 4 hours of programs on the air. That doesn't mean 4 hours a day, it means 4 hours a week.
But as glamorous as they tried to make it, the reality was that with only 9 TV stations in the country, it didn't offer many job opportunities. So despite his near-death experience in the war, Roddenberry decided to pursue his love of flying and became a commercial airline pilot. It was a short-lived career.
Gene was the pilot of a commercial airliner that crashed. I don't remember the exact circumstances of it. I think he was able to pull it out, but it was very much a near-death experience.
Feeling lucky to be alive for a second time, he decided to return back to the States and follow his father's footsteps by working for the Los Angeles Police Department.
I met people who knew him when he was in the police department, when he was a policeman. He said he was the nicest cop I ever met. I never met a cop. and that's the way he was. That's true.
So true that he quickly rose through the ranks to become a sergeant. But he never gave up on his passion for television writing. and in 1954, while still in the LAPD, sold TV scripts to two popular shows, West Point and Highway Patrol.
Recall all units, 10-4. Hi, I'm Broderick Crawford. We have different ways of getting and receiving information on Highway Patrol. When it comes to getting information about TV viewing, I can only say one thing. TV Guide.
3 years later, he finally quit the force and started writing full-time for the hit TV series Have Gun, Will Travel, writing the adventures of a gentleman gunfighter in the Wild West. It was here that he first encountered the do's and don'ts of standards and practices.
Censorship in those days was largely a sexual matter, and whenever the clothes showed a little cleavage or a little too much thigh or a little too much stomach area, why, we were sure to hear from them for the censor.
The networks didn't want anything that would upset Middle America. The censor office Roddenberry and every writer and producer heard from was called Broadcast Standards and Practices.
And what happened over time is that CBS and the other networks developed an internal sense of what behavior was expected of programs as they were presented to the public, and what behaviors and what was portrayed, how that would be perceived by the advertisers to be sure that it was acceptable to them in proximity to their products.
Removes paint, soil stains, grease.
Shows were sponsored by them, and future presidents touted their virtues.
Waterless hand cleaner removes the toughest dirt or stains. Gets hands clean and smooth fast, anytime. In the workshop, camping, on the
Roddenberry
road,
soon learned the importance these advertisers had on what a TV program could show.
In the early days, they censored very heavily, so you didn't get in the way of anything manufactured and sold. I had a show in which I had a newspaperman out on a windy corner holding down a stack of papers with a tire iron. They insisted I write out the tire iron because that conjured up the vision of a failed product.
But really, it all came down to how are we to comport ourselves as invited guests into America's living room. And so that dictated over time an internal kind of understanding of how the characters and how language, how dialogue, how action was portrayed in network television.
Well, I think someday we're going to be very ashamed of much of what we did in TV we took this thing of sound and image and movement, which has such power, and we have it in our homes day and night, constantly going, and we put it in the hands of a salesman.
Roddenberry began to write for a new series, Riverboat, starring Burt Reynolds and Darren McGavin.
There was a show called Mississippi Riverboat. It was on the Mississippi. It was a paddle wheeler. And they just had one clause on the show: no blacks, or in those days, as they called it, no Negroes were allowed in.
In many ways, America was divided into two worlds: the 90% that were white and the nearly 15 million men and women that weren't. For African Americans, day-to-day life was challenging at best. There were states where blacks could not drink from a water cooler, get served in a restaurant, or sit in the front of a bus. When they were portrayed in the media, the stereotyping was plain vicious.
I used to love Andy Griffith's early show with Don Knotts and so on. And I'm sure Andy could do nothing about this. I admire the man. But did you ever see in this small Georgia town of Mayberry a black on the street, anywhere? In fact, we didn't notice those things. The audience was so conditioned, they never noticed such things.
Minorities were sidekicks at best and demeaning stereotypes at worst. For Asian Americans, stereotyping on films or TV often meant being portrayed as ignorant or downright devious.
Multi-ethnic, multicultural, multilingual nation, more so than we've ever been. And it's very important that that reality be depicted on the television screens that we watch, and that have such a powerful impact on shaping people's perceptions. There are a lot of challenges just as an actor, but it's overlaid with the fact that you are of a minority.
Hispanic stereotyping often meant either being a passionate seductress or just becoming a fodder for comedy.
The mixing of races was, because it was still illegal in the United States, was also something that could not be shown. That you couldn't actually show, someone who was, for example, an African-American man and a Caucasian woman being a couple, and I'm not even talking about having any physical contact, because you couldn't really do that even for people who were Caucasian.
I think television has been rather derelict in that. We go by stereotypes. We don't fully depict the individuals that make that up.
One group that was particularly difficult for the network standards and practices to deal with were women. It was a delicate balancing act to figure out what was and was not allowed to be broadcast.
Most women that we saw were at-home moms who were wearing pearls and walking around, making brownies.
You're not listening, Carol.
Yes, I am, honey. Go on.
Oh, good. It is a privilege to address you on the importance of the payroll savings plan for the purchase of savings bonds. This plan is a boon to all Americans because, let us be honest, when a man brings home his hard-earned money at the end of the week, what does he do with it?
Pour into ungreased pan.
He pours it into an ungreased pan.
The traditional values of the 50s were still alive and well at the networks, but changes were just around the corner.
Vietnam War, in mass marches, rallies, and demonstrations. Central Park is the starting point for the parade to the UN building. The estimated 125,000 Manhattan marchers include students, housewives, beatnik poets, doctors, businessmen, teachers, priests, and nuns. Makeup and costumes were bizarre.
For years, those of us who wrote back in the 50s had been writing blacks and Latins into the scripts and using names like Epstein and so on, and having those names changed to Brown and have the blacks and all of them written out. One day, what I heard happened is the people who sell products at TV for TV networks stumble onto the fact that, my God, there's a huge audience out there of blacks and other minorities. And so a memo came down, almost an outraged memo from the network. Why aren't you people writing minorities into scripts? That is the American way. However, if you wrote a black in a script for a long time, you'd better make him a brain surgeon or a physicist. Don't show a black cleaning a house or anything like that.
In 1963, despite all the creative restrictions from the TV establishment, Washington, and American society in general, Roddenberry ventured into this minefield and sold his first series to CBS called The Lieutenant, starring Gary Lockwood.
And then there was this opening for a show called The Lieutenant, and I went in and interviewed and got the job working for Gene Roddenberry and Del Reisman. It was about a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps, very contemporary show at the time, and we were concentrating on, a young man in the military. Starred Gary Lockwood, and his captain was Robert Vaughn. Very good cast.
Because he was the producer, Roddenberry believed he had the power to shape the show exactly the way he wanted. But no sooner had they gone into production when Roddenberry ran into problems with the censor office.
Whenever an actress wore a light blouse, and there was any chance that the teats would show through a little projection on the black blouse, they would tell the actress to go in, and the wardrobe lady would put Band-Aids over them. As you think back, you're reminded of silly children playing games at these things.
It was in the early days of production of The Lieutenant that Roddenberry joined the rest of the country and watched Dr. Martin Luther King's Washington March speech.
We had to understand that we were human beings of quality, and that quality demanded a certain respect for all people.
With the changing attitudes sweeping across the country and the network's encouragement to tackle social issues, Roddenberry saw his opening to really push the envelope even further by producing the episode To Set It Right.
As a matter of fact, I had a script for the lieutenant in those days in which a black was prejudiced against a white, and this caused the heart of the story. And they refused for a long time to allow that to come on the air.
One of the stars of that episode was Nichelle Nichols, a young actress new to Hollywood who made an instant impression on Roddenberry.
And then along came Gene, and I didn't even have to say a word. He said, he saw me in a play or somewhere, and he says to me, I said to myself, I've got to have that girl in something that I'm doing. And he waited, and the rest is history.
Nichols played the fiancé of an African-American soldier that was accused of attacking his white captain. It was a role somewhat unprecedented on television at the time.
Well, I knew there were nobody like me on television doing anything like I was doing a role that wasn't a black role, which meant a maid. The best you could be was a mother with 6 kids. Or something like that.
Other people can say you're behind or you're ahead of society. That was really not our role. Our role was to present programs and advertising in a context that was acceptable and met the expectations of an incredibly large mass audience.
I finally got notes from CORE and NAACP and others saying, look, prejudice comes with every color skin, and it's important that you show that too.
Until I met Gene Roddenberry, I had never met a man, much less a white man, with the kind of mind he had about humanity.
The show may have only lasted a season, but it gave Roddenberry the credentials to pitch other show ideas to the network. It was also at this time that he gathered a group of writers, producers, and actors who he would take along with him to his next project, a show that would change all of their lives forever. This included a character actor who got a part on The Lieutenant and left an impression on Roddenberry.
It was a very flamboyant character, fun character, fast-talking kind of con man kind of guy. I said, I need this and I need that, and we're going to make this movie, and we're going to use thousands of Marines or whatever. So, and they had always seen me playing dark, brooding characters, and this was a flamboyant kind of guy. So I got the job, and that job led to Star Trek, because Gene Roddenberry, although I didn't meet him when I did the show, saw the footage later and had me come in to talk about playing Spock.
All curves and plastic. Monsanto's House of the Future is open to the public at Disneyland.
The mid-1960s was a time of dramatic contrasts in America. To visitors to Disneyland, the future looked like this.
That gets first look. A family food center to store atomically irradiated food. The emphasis is on new uses of plastics in every area of family living, pioneering the use of features that may be standard in 10 years or so. A look at the future. Looks good, eh?
For the youth of America, our future directions were being fought on the street.
In the course of the march. The anti-war marchers were picketed by anti-war marchers who were hawkish toward the parading doves.
And then there was one dream that inspired the entire world, that of opening up outer space to human exploration. To encourage our newfound hope in space travel, NASA created films that would encourage our dreams of space exploration by showing what would be possible after we reached the moon. The stage was set for Roddenberry to explore his love of space and his deep humanistic beliefs. During the final days of production on The Lieutenant, Roddenberry began to write a treatment for his next show based on a vision of the future that he truly believed was possible.
One day called me into his office and he said, would you read this? Tell me what you think. And he pushed about a 12-page, file across the table at me, across his desk. I took it home and I read it, and it was called Star Trek. And I really liked it. And I came in the next day and said, I really like it. And who's going to play Spock?
He first pitched the idea to a major Hollywood studio, Desilu Productions, who liked it, and soon went to CBS. They passed, thinking Star Trek was too close to their own Irwin Allen show, Lost in Space. Undaunted, Roddenberry soon pitched the show to NBC.
The way he had to sell it was to tell the network people that this was wagon train in space.
In our first pilot of Star Trek, which was turned down by the network, we had a female second in command of the Enterprise. She was playing Mr. Spock's first officer position. And when the network fortunately said, okay, we liked it enough to say, here's some money, make another, they said, but no woman second in command. The audience is not going to go for that. And indeed, the audience didn't. In the trial runs, there are memos from even the women in the audience. Who does she think she is? My God, how we progress. We humans do progress.
What the network found in all its wisdom was that the show was too not only cerebral, but sexual. And so that was taken care of, in the first pilot, and brilliantly, including the casting.
Roddenberry compromised in making Spock the #1 officer, but there were larger issues he would not give in on.
There was a great fear that, the first fear I had is when I had my crew, bridge crew from all areas of the world, Asian and black and Scottish and this and that. One of the early crews had a Latin in it. And the feeling by a lot of the network people and business people was, we can't promote one world-ism. This should be a good old American ship with good old American types. And I managed to resist doing that. I refused.
A male alien was more acceptable than a female human being to the networks. So Spock became the science officer as well as the first officer.
He said, the Starship Enterprise is a metaphor for Starship Earth, and the strength of the starship is in its diversity. And so he wanted to have that diversity reflected in the makeup of the crew, in the casting of the crew. And my character was supposed to represent Asia. And as you know, Uhura, the female communications officer, was supposed to represent Africa.
I was the first one on TV with an equal role. You just didn't do that. If you came on, you were either, the best you could be was a mother of somebody. You just did not have roles for African American, brown people, especially at all on television. Now, no, that's a little hard to take right now because it just doesn't seem possible that I'm sitting here telling you about it.
You know, what's important to remember is it is a show that kind of had an author behind it, meaning like, Gene Roddenberry was sort of the voice, of the show. It did sort of have a vision. And there actually aren't that many shows, if you kind of look, that really sort of have that authorship attached to it. There's some people that were like comedy writers and, so on. And definitely some performers, in television like Lucy or people like Ed Sullivan and so on. But I think the fact that it was kind of this sort of one man's vision, and that was sort of somewhat unique, I think, in television at the time.
Star Trek was given a go-ahead. The show was a rating hit, and Roddenberry was optimistic about the show's future, even if some of his cast had doubts.
And I said, Gene, they're not going to keep us long here. We're going to be off before the season is out. He said, do you know why that's not true? And I said, no. He says, because we're talking about real life. We're talking about what's real. You're real. Captain Kirk is real. We are real. We take place in the future. But we're talking about the future is coming whether we like it or not, and this is what it's going to look like. And it suddenly came all together to me. Wow, this man is changing history.
Over the coming weeks, the show's ratings declined, but NBC didn't give up on it because young people were watching in droves, and advertisers let the network know that this was a group they wanted to reach.
I just know that I watched this show and it spoke to something, but there was just something about it that was so unlike any other television show that I had ever seen.
Roddenberry once again had to face the issues of censorship. During the production of Star Trek, numerous takes were censored for obvious reason. The actors simply messed up. But Star Trek faced an entire different set of censors, and those dealt with issues that Star Trek brought up. Issues that many in the network, TV stations, and viewing public were not equipped to deal with. Despite NBC's efforts to make the show appealing to everyone, there were groups in America that definitely didn't want anyone to watch Star Trek, and neither Roddenberry nor the powerful network executives had any control.
And then when I got Nichelle Nichols to do the job of radio communications officer, why, there was great fear of that. As a matter of fact, throughout the South, station managers refused to show Star Trek the first year, and I think the multi-racial crew and the first regular black female on television may have prompted that.
During this time, television stations in the American South fought tooth and nail to avoid broadcasting anything to do with integration. In places like Jackson, Mississippi, station WLBT not only censored Star Trek, but also any civil rights stories, including those shown on the evening news.
If a southern station decides, okay, we're not going to show this because it had something in it that people in their area would object to, the question becomes, do we show it or not, particularly when whatever it is actually becomes quite popular.
Toward the end of the first year, after all the censorship battles both at the network and in the American South, Nichols told Roddenberry that she had enough.
And she was always a little unhappy about always having to say, hailing frequencies open, sir, and those kinds of things.
Calling Starbase 6. Come in, Starbase 6.
She was ready to quit. That is, until she met an unexpected Star Trek fan that would change her life.
I met Dr. King, and to me, Dr. King was the be-all, end-all for our race and for anybody else's race. And I met him, and I was like, I can't believe. And it turns out he had a little hatsu because I was one of his favorite characters on television. And it was from then on that I realized I was part of something much more than a role for myself, which was the role of a lifetime as far as I was concerned, for myself or anybody else.
Star Trek was picked up for another season, but Roddenberry's difficult relationship with NBC didn't ease up.
We would do some rewriting on it before we sent it to NBC, who perceived it as the first draft story outline, and then they had their suggestions to make, which we had to take care of. We also had to send a copy to Broadcast Standards, which freely translated is the censor.
You very often lose with the censors, but sometimes you can trade things like, I'll give you 3 fervent embraces for 1 slightly open-mouthed kiss. And you sit around discussing these things without a smile on your face. It's all very serious.
Despite the show's popularity with a younger audience, the network decided to move Star Trek to a later time. And just as they experienced in the first year, it was always a series of battles just to get a script approved.
I don't know whether censorship or trying to direct the nature of the show. There were some people very upset that when they saw the pilot that nobody was smoking, because we forget sometimes that cigarettes were huge advertisers and great amounts of money were made on them. And so some people came to me and said, you've got to have someone smoke. And I said, I don't believe they'll do that in a future year. Even though I smoked myself at that time, I thought we'd get more sensible. And one of them said, oh, come on, Gene, you are a creative fellow. Why don't you invent sort of a space cigarette, like something, a long square cigarette? And I've often thought how Star Trek would be rerunning today if Mr. Spock had sat there at his science station puffing on a space cigarette.
The network did not limit its input to advertising ideas. One of the most common complaints centered on clothing, especially costumes meant to portray society 200 years into the future.
The costume designer and the producer, they wanted the women with the short skirts because this is in the future and they're not going to all walk around in pants looking alike.
The biggest censorship problem we had was Bill Tice's costumes, which were always threatening to fall off the ladies. Of course, they never would have, because the women were glued in and taped in and everything else. But there was always that little hint that maybe something would slip and you'd get to see something. You never did.
And they changed my seating by the door so that whenever you fanned over toward the door, here she was. And if I ever did this, they'd come and, Nichelle, let me fix your seat, and they'd turn the seat back around. And, no, that's not it. And I'd go like that, and they says, oh, that's fine. It's and I knew what they wanted to begin with, but I just continued to act like I didn't know what they're talking about. I put it, and it finally got, to cross my leg. Something as silly as just crossing your leg, You cross your leg, I cross my leg. Everybody crosses their leg when they sit down,
One show we had a sort of a belly dancer type thing from another planet, and NBC decided that navels weren't nice to see, and they made us cut all the scenes with the navels in them, and just about emasculated the show. After story of that was several years later. I was doing a show called Genesis 2, and for NBC, and suddenly occurred to me that NBC owes me a navel, and so I had a strange race in here, and I decided to give them 2 navels so I could have my navel back, and it worked out well. So much is at stake as a writer and a producer, wanting to get some of your messages across. You find you have to compromise, otherwise none of it gets on the air. And so, as I suppose art has been since the very beginning, it's sort of the art of compromise.
At the end of Star Trek's second season, the network decided to wash their hands of what many had now just felt was a program with low ratings and canceled the show.
I was not involved with fandom. I knew nothing about fandom, but I had been a great fan of Star Trek. And so I think it was about 15, 16 years old. I went down to NBC, and there were hundreds of people picketing the network. And I met a whole bunch of people. As a matter of fact, I can date some of my best friends to having met them picketing, picketing NBC.
Refusing to take defeat without a fight, Roddenberry helped organize a national letter-writing campaign to save the show. In an era in which receiving 100 letters would get the network's attention, they were soon bombarded with tens of thousands of letters.
And I think they were disillusioned or disappointed with the show, frankly. So they didn't give it an awful lot of promotion in the first season. Second season, they scheduled it very badly. They kept scheduling it at worse and worse time slots, almost as if it were going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy that the show wasn't going to work.
The campaign to save Star Trek bought Roddenberry one more year. But the network decided to further cut their budget and move it to 10 p.m. on Friday night, a time slot known to be a program killer for shows geared to a younger audience.
So they reluctantly brought it back, put it in the death slot. I mean, Friday at 10 o'clock was when their demographic was on dates.
With the move to late night, NBC's executives assumed the show would slowly fade away. But Star Trek's producers had other ideas. NBC's executives and censors suddenly had to work overtime, particularly with one episode, Plato's Stepchildren.
So this was a disagreeable one for me. It was a show in which Captain Kirk kissed Uhura, who is black.
It was unprecedented, an interracial kiss on television. Both the studio and the network were concerned that many in America weren't ready.
I think that it's not ironic that it actually was kind of the show that Star Trek would be the first show to do this, because it is a science fiction show, and you're given a little bit more room to do that. At the same time, I'm sure they were aware of what they were doing and probably nervous about it. And it's not unusual when something is potentially controversial to actually possibly shoot it something in more than one ways.
I believe that the networks were worried about the interracial kiss between Uhura and Kirk because they had no idea what they thought was right.
After the first review of the script, the network came back with a warning. Any inference or reference to the point made by the writer that our heroes would be forced to make love to one another as a form of sport for their captors is unacceptable to NBC.
And so we all went in and said, well, we aren't going to shoot it that way. You're going to have to fire all of us. And in other words, you're going to have to fire all of us and get new people. One of the heads of the studio from New York, he came out. I was one of his favorite actors. And he came over and he walked over and said, Miss Nichols, I just wanted to tell you how much I enjoy your work and so forth. And he looked at, he said, who's that? And this is my grandmother and grandfather. He cracked up. He cracked up. And he went back and said, there will be no more discussion. There'll be no more argument over. It stays. And that's how it went on television.
And one of the people on the show, at that time I was kind of moving away from the show, took an ad in local trade papers, see it happen, as if this was some fantastic thing, a black kisses a white on television. And I was too late to keep the ad from being shown, but it annoyed me, although other people seemed to think, wow, yeah, great, you're such a pioneer. To me, it's a totally ridiculous thing, and I'm sorry that it ever happened. I think we should have been kissing each other always.
And they put the show on for one more season, but as if to prove that the show couldn't do well, they put us on at 10 o'clock on Friday night, date night. All of our audience would be out, not watching television. And sure enough, the show did dismally in the third season. Never was a big hit, but it did even worse in the third than it had done in the first or second, and we were gone. That was the end of it.
Star Trek has gone from a short-lived television show on the fringe of mainstream entertainment to a huge fandom that has taken Roddenberry's vision as their own. That part of his journey began in the days after the cancellation, when some very surprising things began to happen.
It was really like Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney saying, let's put on a show. Yeah. And, you know, with the naivete of youth, we said, let's do, because we all love Star Trek and we're very unhappy that the show had been canceled. And as I say, we decided to do a Star Trek convention.
Eileen got in touch with Roddenberry, who agreed to participate in the event, and then went about creating the first Star Trek convention.
So we're, you know, trying to decide how to do this, how to run this. We went to Paramount. We asked them if we could have a couple of the episodes. And again, nobody had ever done anything like this. Nobody had ever heard anything like that. So Paramount said, hey, you know, we'll give you all 78 episodes. So they sent us, you know, the episodes in 16 millimeter. We went to NASA. We asked if, you know, we might, you know, be able to, you know, get a couple of things from them to do an exhibit because, you know, Star Trek had been so important to, you know, to NASA and the space program. And They sent us a spacesuit, a 1/3 size mock-up of the LEM, an astronaut. I mean, we had a NASA room. You know, Gene and Majel, came out. DC Fontana came out.
The next challenge was hoping a few fans would attend.
It went viral because the national, it went out on the network feed. So by Saturday morning, people were flying in from all over the world. By Saturday, I'm sorry, they were flying in from all over the country. By Saturday night, they were flying in from all over the world. There was not a hotel room in New York to be had.
That, to me, is the strength of what Gene Roddenberry brought. He created an atmosphere and a world where we could mirror and see ourselves more clearly.
What I call real Star Trek fandom helped change the world. They believed in what we were playing to the degree that as it came back to us, we believed, we realized that we believe what we're playing.
Roddenberry's career spanned the first 4 decades of television. In that time, he helped create one of the greatest entertainment franchises in history.
But it is a marvelous town of marvelous people. The creative people do think daringly, and they do support diverse opinions and points of view, and that helped make it possible.
He felt that television was a potent medium that was being wasted with the kind of pap that we had on television at that time.
The fact TV hasn't been all bad is really due to very brave individuals, such as the Norman Lears of our society, who came in and literally forced TV to do something good. And they never wanted to. They always tried to cancel these shows, but if a show gets a certain rating, then the network becomes afraid to cancel it because, wow, ratings are important.
On September 17, 1976, the first space shuttle rolled out of its hangar. NASA received thousands of letters suggesting one name, USS Enterprise. Guests of honor that day were future astronauts, NASA officials, and the crew of another USS Enterprise, the cast of the TV series Star Trek.
But they could not believe the entire cast. Not only the entire cast, there was half of the studio itself was there. So they were just thrilled.
In the conversations that I had with Gene, it came out time and time again that what made him the most proud of Star Trek, that when somebody came up to him and said, I became a doctor because of Star Trek. I became a teacher because of Star Trek. I became an astronaut, a scientist, whatever it was, that this television show had that kind of influence.
A great believer in science, not much of a believer in theology. Quite the contrary, wouldn't have anything on the show that had to do with God. No gods, please. No worshiping, please. Science, science, science.
Even when it comes to the films, the films spread out, and all the films talk about something that's really important or worth talking about. The one that I did, Star Trek Generations, talks about time and the underlying philosophical content of it. Hey, I'm talking about underlying philosophical content in a science fiction action movie.
I knew from the moment I saw it, if it gets on the air and stays more than one episode, we'll be there forever.
We will take this solar system and build a complex there, and then when we do that, we will become wise enough during that adolescent period, I think, then to consider going on to the stars. And we need some wisdom before we go out there and start screwing around with the intelligent life that is actually out there. Us who make the show, we in this room here, we have marvelous arguments about what is the proper way to run a government, and so on. And so it's delightful. It's honestly, if I could afford it, don't tell the studio this, but I would pay to come to work here. I think, in fact, obviously, it has turned out that they misread the attitudes of their viewers, because during all the years of Star Trek, we never had a single complaint, a single hate letter on any of this. As a matter of fact, we often used to sit around and saying it seems to us that the audience is light years ahead of the country's leaders.